You want to go through, Laura?
Yes, so as we discussed last time, if you are eligible to fast track for a PhD, um, you're more than welcome to contact us, to contact, in fact, Sharon. She's going to give you all the instructions, and we have funds that we offer for the fast tracks. So if you're interested in the summer 2024 medical technology internship, it passed fast. I'm just letting you know, send us an email with your CV. We will match your CV with the companies that we have. And if we find a company who selects you, we can allow you to register for the summer internship. So please don't forget that you are required to present at least one time in the seminar series. I didn't receive any emails from students presenters. So please contact me and I'll put you on the list. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and I apologize profusely for the delay and for the technical difficulties. So when I was invited to give this webinar, I was informed that some of you hadn't attended my previous webinar that I had given in November. And some of you were new to the field of research ethics, and I was welcome to present some of the material that I had given in my previous webinar. Therefore, the objectives for this first part of the seminar are similar to that of my previous webinar. Next, please. To give you a background on the REB's authority and structure, to help you appreciate the roles of each REB member and their corresponding responsibilities. But for the second part of the webinar, it involves new material and objectives. So I will address issues involving research with biological materials and medical devices, and also discuss the risks involved in patient-reported outcome research. Next, please. That's the outline, thank you. So that's part one. Next, yes. In my previous webinar, I mentioned several major scandals that occurred in the 20th century. I paid special attention to the Nuremberg Code, which was created as a result of the horrific experiments conducted on victims of the Nazi concentration camps. The Nuremberg Code is considered the most important document in the history of ethics of medical research. This code, as well as ethical frameworks, laws, policies, and standards that we have in place, came about not because it was the right thing to do, but overwhelmingly as a result of scandals and abuses. You see here listed several scandals posted on this slide. Later in this presentation, I will discuss the scandal highlighted involving Henrietta Lacks. It involved the extraction and use of her tissue samples. To begin this presentation, I will discuss the establishment of REB governance structures. Next, please. Research ethics boards were established in Quebec first in 1967. By 1990, 56 of them were in place. In 1998, the Minister of Health and Social Services adopts a framework to structure REBs. In 1990, the Ministry of Health and Social Services revises this regulatory framework and adopts a new one, and updates the requirements for the structure of REBs. And this regulatory framework applies to all human research conducted in the Quebec Health Care Network. Next, please. Simply put, the role of the REB is to protect the rights of human participants and promote their well-being in research studies. Next, please. As I mentioned, in 2020, Quebec adopted a new regulatory framework entitled Le Cadre de référence ministériel pour la recherche avec les participants humains. And it's a document that those of you who are consider a career in research in Quebec should become familiar with this document. It makes specific how REBs are structured within institutions that form part of the Quebec Health and Social Services Network. Importantly, it highlights that the REB is independent in its decision-making. The REB exists as an independent body within the institution, and it reports directly to the institution's board of directors. And the role of the board of directors, as spelled out in this framework, is to appoint research ethics committee members upon the recommendation of the REB. And the board of directors is obliged to provide funding and support for the functioning of the REB. The institution has a responsibility for ensuring that the REB is protected from undue influence and is independent in its decision-making. Next, please. For any research study conducted within its jurisdiction, the REB can approve it when the REB is satisfied that all conditions that it requires are met. They can require modifications to a study when these modifications are requested, these are usually called conditional approvals. The REB can refuse a study outright, which is rare. It can defer a decision about a study. This usually happens when the REB is lacking information, so it can come to a decision. And the REB can suspend it. For example, if an allegation of misconduct has come to its attention, or if the REB approval has expired and an application for annual renewal has not been submitted within the time frame required. Finally, the REB can terminate a study. Such a situation may occur when participants are placed at risk for harm. The REB can request, receive, and share information that it thinks necessary, and if it shares information with different parties, the REB must ensure the confidentiality of that information. Next, please. The REB takes any reasonable steps to ensure that the rights of participants are protected and their well-being promoted. For instance, if it becomes aware of allegations of misconduct, it can request that the study become an object of a review. It can also request that a research team receive education on research ethics. The REB ensures ongoing oversight of research studies. It conducts passive reviews, which are mandatory, such as reviewing annual review of ongoing studies when study approvals expire, amendments, serious adverse event reporting, and so on. It can also conduct active reviews as per the Ministry of Health and Social Services regulatory framework. The REB can actively conduct random or targeted reviews of ongoing approved studies in a systematic fashion. We don't have such a program in place that would allow for such reviews, but one is envisioned. Next, please. The CIUSSS Central Montreal has a special designated status granted to it by the Minister of Health and Social Services. This designation permits our REB to review studies involving minors and persons incapable of giving consent. Article 21 of the Civil Code stipulates the following: the research study involving minors and adults incapable of giving consent must be approved and monitored by a competent research ethics committee. Such a committee is formed by the Minister of Health and Social Services or designated by that minister from among existing research ethics committee. The composition and operating conditions of such a committee are determined by the minister and published in the Gazette Officielle du Québec. Next, please. According to this regulatory framework, when investigators submit a study to the REB, it must undergo a triple review process. This three-part review process includes, of course, a research ethics review conducted by the REB, but it also includes a scholarly review known as a science review and a feasibility review. A scholarly review is conducted to ensure the study meets relevant disciplinary standards. It's unethical to list participants in a study if a study is not considered to have scientific merit. If a study was approved for scholarly merit by an outside scientific committee recognized by the RB, such as those from granting agencies such as FRSQ, SSHRC, CIHR, the study then does not require a scholarly review, but note there are exceptions. Importantly, the REB's mandate does require examining the ethical implications of a proposed research methodology for any given study. The feasibility review is conducted to ensure, as the name implies, that the research is feasible at the institution where the study will take place. At our institution, a specialist at the RRO manages the feasibility review. The specialist may contact different departments or institutional actors, depending on the nature of the study. And the researcher very often obtains approval letters from these departments, and they are uploaded in the application form to the REB. This feasibility review must cover at least the availability of the institution's facilities, equipment, and human resources to conduct the research, the financial and contract aspects of the research, so researchers might have to contact the legal department, its coverage by liability insurance, and where applicable, its impact on the institution's resources. It also involves how drugs are managed, so pharmacy is involved, depending on the nature of the study. The feasibility also involves examining any conflict of interest between the research and the orientations of the institution, examines aspects of data security, and important due to a recent law passed in the Quebec National Assembly known as Loi 25, changes regarding institutional requirements for conducting retrospective health research without participants' consent were implemented. For this type of research, researchers must fill out what is called an EFVP form, which is found on the Nagano platform when you, in the submission form, when researchers submit such a study. The information on the form focuses on the confidentiality and security of health record data accessed, used, and stored. Once the REB approves a retrospective health records research study, it's a mouthful, without the participant's consent, the study and the EFVP form is evaluated by a special committee, and importantly, that I want to stress, completely separate from the REB as part of the feasibility review. So we have a lot of questions sometimes and say, hey, I've got REB approval, how come I can't start my study? Because you have to wait for this committee to grant approval and other processes to follow. So once a study has received scientific REB and feasibility approval, an institution letter of authorization is issued and signed by Dr. Tonu Nguyen, Director of Academic Affairs and Research Ethics. And this letter is sent to the principal investigator of the study. The letter gives permission to the investigator to begin conducting the study at this institution. No study can commence until the researcher no study can commence until the researcher receives the institutional authorization letter, even if the study has received REB approval. It's happened that some researchers begin their study after they receive REB approval, but before receiving the institutional letter of authorization. Conducting a study without institutional authorization is not permitted by the institution and the Quebec Ministry of Health and Social Services, as set out in Quebec's regulatory framework. Next, please. How is the REB composed for quorum meeting requirements? It must be composed of at least 2 members with expertise in relevant disciplines and methodologies. That means that these members must have expertise in areas of...
Have a brain, you can use it.
I'm sorry, I hear noise.
No, it's not. This question was, please, can you do the thinking job instead of me, and then I'll just execute.
Can you please mute?
Can you please mute someone? At our institution, the REB is composed of, okay, sorry, I don't remember where I was. This means that these members must have expertise in the areas of study that they're asked to review. So if you're submitting a study involving surgical techniques, well, there has to be somebody on the REB that's familiar with that type of research. At our institution, the REB is composed of two committees, the Biomedical Committee and the Psychosocial Committee. The Medical Biomedical Committee that reviews clinical trials must include at minimum a physician, dentist, or pharmacist belonging to a professional order, and one member experienced in a non-scientific discipline. Regarding the Psychosocial Committee, it requires two members that are familiar with different methodologies such as qualitative, participatory, survey research, statistical analysis, and so on. An REB also includes one member knowledgeable in ethics and one member knowledgeable in relevant law, and this person can't be a member of a paid member of the institution, cannot be the legal counsel of the institution, because that would place this person in a conflict of interest. The REB must include at least one community member, and this community member must not have affiliation to the institution, sponsor, and not the sponsor of the study, and not part of the immediate family of a person affiliated with the institution. This community member represents the point of view of research participants or the community to which the participant belongs. This community member can be an individual or a representative of an organization interested in promoting the rights of people in the areas of research being reviewed, such as a community organization. Finally, it's to be noted that the higher level institutional administrators of the institution cannot serve as REB members. REB can include alternate members who can vote on decisions. It can include ad hoc advisors who can provide expertise on a particular topic but cannot vote. That happens when we have so many different types of studies. So one may come in on a new kind of research or a specific topic that we don't get frequently. So we can recruit ad hoc advisors. The REB can also include observers upon the approval of the REB. Observers cannot vote. Very often, new members are asked to sit as observers before they become members. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about the specialist. The specialist is the person who runs the committee and takes care of the research study for you when you submit it. The specialist is a non-voting member. The specialist supports the chair and supports REB members by answering their questions and offers guidance and support based on laws and policies. The specialist advises REB members of new developments in the field, such as changes to legislation like Loi 25 and the implementation of new policies and procedures. I've already mentioned the specialist organizes meetings and provides administrative support to the REB, drafts of meeting agendas and minutes, integrates and synthesizes REB comments to be reviewed by the chair, which is then sent to the investigators by the chair. The specialist also manages and tracks the review of REB submissions to which they're assigned, and they answer researchers' questions about the REB member comments they receive. However, if you have questions about a study before you submit it to the REB, then you can contact me, the Research Ethics Advisor, or the Research Review Office. Once a study has been accepted for review, then the specialist is solely responsible for the study and for answering any questions from the investigator or the research team members. Next, please. So what is the role of the chair? The chair evidently is to chair meetings. And the chair is appointed by the board of directors, ensures that meetings are conducted in accordance with applicable laws and policies, ensures that the contributions of all REB members attending this meeting are heard, can request the removal of an REB member with justification. The REB chair assigns studies to REB members with the assistance of the specialist. The REB chair monitors the REB's decisions for accuracy and consistency and is responsible to ensure all decisions conform to applicable laws, policies, and regulations. The chair is also responsible for ensuring that REB decisions are consistent. The chair oversees the accuracy of the minutes and the comments that are sent to investigator. And the power of the chair depends on what is submitted. But examples include when the REB learns that a participant is placed at risk by taking part in a study, or when investigator misconduct is suspected, but the chair can't terminate a study. This decision must be taken at a full board REB meeting. Finally, the REB chair, with the input of the specialist, determines whether a study is eligible for delegated review. In the following slide, I'll discuss what is meant by studies eligible for delegated review. Next, please. An important distinction is to be made between minimal risk and above minimal risk studies that REBs are asked to review. Researchers should be aware that studies receive different levels of scrutiny based on the degree of foreseeable risks of harm. Those that are determined to be above minimal risks are reviewed at a full board meeting at a preset date where quorum is required. Those studies that are determined to be minimal risk of harm are reviewed by one or more REB members who are delegated to review these studies as soon as they are assigned to them. They are not reviewed at an REB meeting. Next, please. For those who have never submitted a study to our REB, the initial process is as follows. You submit your study on the online platform named Nagano. You should have you contact the REB Research Review Office first to obtain an account. The submitted study is screened by a gatekeeper according to specific criteria. This screening is best defined as a process to ensure that the submitted study contains the information the REB requires to conduct its review. If the study does not contain the information that the REB requires, then we're all wasting our time. The gatekeeper returns suboptimal submissions, that is, those that do not meet the criteria for REB review. And if we open the form and we ask you to provide more information, it could be that information is missing, or information may be inaccurate, or documents contain inconsistencies. And we could also find that the protocol may be unclear or illogical that would lead REB members to be confused, or consent form guidelines. And if your consent form guidelines aren't followed, we would also return that back to you. It's really unfair to ask REB members to waste their time on studies that are not ready for their review. And it also wastes the researcher's time because the process is much longer, the back and forth between the researcher and the REB. The role of the gatekeeper is not to weigh in on significant ethical issues that arise in any given submission. This role is strictly under the purview of the REB. However, the gatekeeper helps the researcher avoid delays. The gatekeeper provides educational support to researchers for submissions that are seen to be suboptimal. The gatekeeper can provide advice and resources to researchers. Once an REB submission meets the criteria for acceptable REB review, it is assigned to an REB specialist. It is at this point the specialist is responsible for processing the submission for REB review. The specialist, as indicated previously, is a non-voting member of the REB, and once you submit a study and it's assigned, your point person is the specialist. Once the REB reviews the submission, the specialist can answer any of your questions, and including those that come from the REB. Next, please. The remainder of this presentation entails ethical issues related to biological materials, medical devices, and patient-reported outcome research. Next, please. So what are biological materials? What do we consider are biological materials? These materials can include tissues, organs, blood, plasma, skin, serum, DNA, RNA, tooth plaque, urine, hair, nail clippings, saliva, and other bodily fluids. Ethical issues involving biological materials include access to this material. Who is granted access? By what means is access granted? Ethical issues involve the use of these materials. Who is granted use of these materials? How are they used? Are appropriate facilities and equipment in place? Ethical issues can involve privacy and confidentiality. What privacy protections are in place? Will the biological samples be linked with patient health records or other data? And how will participant data be held secure? Will the type of research contain risks for re-identification? What type of record keeping is in place? And researchers must also take into account the special status of certain groups, such as indigenous populations, when using biological materials. Certain groups, such as biological communities, have developed their own criteria for their use, and researchers must respect them. There's a chapter, I'm not sure what there's a chapter in the TCPS2, the policy document, that addresses research with indigenous groups, conducting research with indigenous groups. Next slide, please. Biological materials can be classified into two major types: identifiable biological materials and non-identifiable biological materials. And the first type, identifiable biological materials, can be classified into two types as well. So identifiable biological materials can be named identified. That means they are those with that hold a direct identifier, such as a name, date of birth, and so on. De-identified, the other category is the de-identified coded biological materials. This is when you code the data where direct identifiers are removed from the biological materials and replaced with a code, but the researcher retains the code that can identify donors. And there are two types of non-identifiable biological materials as well. The first type is anonymous, and they never had identifiers. And the second type is anonymized biological materials. That means that the identifiers were stripped irrevocably and no code key. Many people get confused between anonymous and anonymized, and I'm highlighting it here. They are not the same. A study involving genetic analysis makes it difficult to categorize samples as de-identified, especially as you can imagine, the samples are linked to other data. Genetic analysis may involve the identification not only of individuals or groups, and so they have the potential to pose great threats to privacy. Using anonymized or anonymous biological materials may seem advantageous to researchers at first glance, but there are significant disadvantages as well. The use of anonymized or anonymous human biological materials has the disadvantage of making it impossible to link data. Many research studies involve the linkage of biological materials with research participants' health or other data to advance human research. Researchers can't inform research participants about research findings when the biological samples they use are anonymized or anonymous. Researchers can't alert participants to incidental findings they may uncover in their analysis, such as undiagnosed diseases, such as diabetes or cancer, which are treatable. And participants cannot request that researchers withdraw their biological samples, as it would be impossible to do so using anonymized or anonymous samples. Article 22 of the Civil Code includes this article of law. Sorry, next, please. A part of the body, whether an organ or tissue or other substance, removed from a person as part of the care he receives with his consent or that of another person qualified to give consent on his behalf, may be used for research purposes, or if he has died, to be used so with the consent of the person who could give or could have given consent to any care required by his state of health. So what does this mean? How does this apply? This means that residual biological materials collected for clinical purposes may not be used for research purposes without the patient's explicit consent. This means researchers cannot decide to conduct a study using biological samples that were collected from hospital patients during their care for clinical purposes without first obtaining these patients' explicit written form consent that the samples will be used for research purposes. Similarly, you cannot use human biological samples that you may come across stored in a lab and decide to use them for research purposes without the consent of the person who provided these samples. The consent requirement, you may be aware, if you know of others conducting research elsewhere, may be different in other jurisdictions. But in Quebec, informing consent for the use of biological materials, as I read in this article of law, has to be followed. In other jurisdictions in Canada, the use of biological samples without consent may be permitted, but again, they can be used, but only under very specific conditions. Researchers must follow any applicable guidelines like the TCPS2 in Canada, and laws in the jurisdiction where the study will be conducted have to be followed. Next, please. If a person's biological materials are used in research, explicit written informed consent must be obtained from this person or an authorized third party. For use in a particular study, such as a study where a researcher may be testing an intervention but wishes to obtain participants' tissue and blood samples and data contained in these patients' health records. So you're extracting tissues for the use of a particular study. Alternately, a researcher may decide to create a biobank whereby the researcher collects biological samples from participants and stores them in a biobank for future research purposes. The creation of a biobank is considered research. In such a case, participants give explicit consent to donate their biological samples that are held in a biobank for future research purposes that are very specific. They don't have to be very specific, but they must be specified. Sorry, correction. Next, please. Before I provide more information on the creation of biobanks, I will discuss a scandal that contributed to major changes in the way human biological materials are accessed, used, and stored for research purposes. Some of you may have heard already about Henrietta Lacks. Hers is a dark story where the respect of her human rights went amiss. In 1951, Henrietta was a 30-year-old African-American woman suffering from severe vaginal hemorrhaging. She had 5 families, and the family was extremely poor. And she was admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital in a racially segregated unit of the hospital because racial discrimination was very common at the time. While physicians were trying to diagnose her condition, a tissue sample was taken from her tumor in Henrietta's cervix, but was done without her consent or knowledge. Henrietta died of cervical cancer several months after being admitted to the hospital. Her physician shared Henrietta's tissue sample with a researcher. It's important to note that removing tissue samples and sharing them was legal at the time. Under analysis, the researcher found the cells to be immortal, meaning it was the first time a documented cell line was found that was capable of surviving and dividing indefinitely. Henrietta's cells were labeled HeLa after the first two initials of her first and last name. Over time, her cell line was used in the understanding of diseases such as polio, the behavior of cancer cells, HIV, Ebola, Parkinson's disease, in vitro fertilization, viruses, including the flu and COVID-19, and it was used to study the impact of radiation. Her cells were also taken into outer space to study the impact of space travel on the body. The contribution of this cell line to modern medicine is incalculable. Next. So great was the contribution of this cell line, the National Institutes of Health in the United States created a web page listing the contribution of this cell line by year, disease type, and the Nobel Prizes awarded to researchers that used it. Next, please. Over the years, Henrietta's cells were shared widely. The discoveries that resulted from their use were extremely lucrative and made billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies and science organizations. Henrietta's family received no compensation, yet they themselves remained without the financial resources to obtain appropriate health care. Henrietta's children only learned about the use of their mother's cells in 1973. In time, Henrietta's full name, health records were part of the public record. They were made public. In 2013, researchers posted a whole genome sequence of a strain of HeLa cells online. So this information obviously reveals sensitive prognostic information about Henrietta and her family. After intense criticism, the information was removed from the website. Henrietta's family sought legal action to try to atone for the past injustices that were done against them. John Hopkins eventually came to an agreement with Henrietta Lacks' family. The NIH established the HeLa Data Use Agreement, whereby NIH-funded researchers who sequence HeLa cells deposit data in a controlled access database. Henrietta's family sits on a committee that examines the application to use these data. More recently, in August of 2023, Henrietta's family reached a settlement over a lawsuit with a biotech company, Thermo Fisher Scientific. They accused the company of selling Henrietta's cells and securing intellectual property rights on the products the company developed without seeking the family's approval and compensating them. Next, please. What happened to Henrietta Lacks and her samples exemplifies a failure to respect human right to control one's own biological samples. Therefore, if a person's biological materials are used in research, the person is henceforth a research participant, with all the rights and researcher obligation this designation entails. Next, please. So what are the takeaways? Why did I spend so much time telling you this story? The takeaways regarding Henrietta Lacks' story involves not only the requirement to obtain informed consent for the use of biological materials, but the requirement for accountability about the ownership of the samples, patient control. The unjust commercialization and exploitation of Henrietta's biological samples tremendously impacted modern medicine and served to create great wealth for scientific organizations and industry, while her family faced racial discrimination, poverty, and denied appropriate health care. Another takeaway is the requirement to ensure the confidentiality of information obtained and produced as a result of the research. Henrietta's personal health information, including genetic information, was made public. The last takeaway is the requirement to maintain the public's trust. Henrietta's story generated mistrust in research, particularly among marginalized groups, many of whom have a history of research exploitation. Public mistrust in research prevents medical progress, and some would say helps support pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. Next, please. Today's biobanks have been created for the storage of biological materials and research and related data for research purposes. According to Anna Rotoni, a proper definition of biobanks is a large collection of biospecimens linked to relevant personal health information, health records, family history, lifestyle, genetic information, etc., that are held predominantly for use in health and medical research. Biobanks can be created according to disease type, for a widespread population, or to store blood, tissue, tumor cells, or other types of samples and related health data, and they can be linked to other databases. There are many ethical issues about the appropriate creation and use of biobanks that is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I refer you to Aratoni's article that I cited here for those of you that are interested in the topic. Even with the creation of databanks, ethical scandals have occurred. In the early 2000s, documented ethical scandals occurred in countries such as the UK and Austria. These scandals involved consent issues where persons donating their biological materials to a biobank were not fully informed how their samples would be used or were not given the choice to opt out. Unfortunately, thanks to these scandals, unfortunately, thanks to these scandals and that of Henrietta Lacks, they increased awareness and stricter regulations regarding biobanking practices, including informed consent, data protection, and patient-centered approaches. These regulations, as I mentioned when I began this webinar, did not come along because someone had the foresight to think this was the right thing to do, but due to scandals and the failure to respect ethical principles. Next, please. So if you're a researcher and you want to create a biobank and the CIUSSS Central Montreal, what are the requirements? The information can be found on the Nagano platform in the documentation center section, and you can see the section on how to create a biobank. One document sets out a policy and procedures on biobanking and the management of biological materials and related data for research purposes. This document was approved by the institution's board of directors. Another document serves as a guideline and template on how to write a consent form for those consenting to donate their biological materials for research purposes and any data to be associated with those materials. Importantly for researchers to know, the CIUSSS Central Montreal houses several biobanks for researchers interested in conducting secondary research. If you wish to conduct a study where you access and use biological materials and data held in one of our existing biobanks, you're conducting a secondary use study, and your study must be approved by the REB. In the case when you're conducting a study using a biobank outside our institution, your study must also be approved by the REB. But when you submit your study, a letter from the agency responsible giving you permission to access that data bank must be uploaded onto the application form, the REB application form, as well as the biobank's governance framework and the participant consent form that was used for this biobank when the participants gave consent. Next, please. I'm only going to touch briefly upon medical devices and medical device software. If you're considering designing a study involving the development of an experimental medical device, an experimental medical software device, or the testing of one already licensed in Canada, but intended for another use, Canadian federal regulations apply. These regulations form part of the Health Canada Food and Drug Act. I've posted a link to these documents produced by Health Canada for your benefit. These guidelines also include information on the classification of devices. Their classification is usually based on the level of invasiveness of the medical device. But the classification regarding medical device software, privacy issues are highlighted. Finally, when submitting a study to the REB, an ITA, or Investigational Testing Authorization Letter from Health Canada, must be obtained and uploaded on the Nagano study application form. Note that some medical devices contain medical device software. So you may need an ITA for separate ITA letters from Health Canada for the medical device and the medical device software. Next, please. So what type of issues can arise in a medical device or medical device software research? I'll just briefly touch upon a few of them. You have to consider if the device is appropriate for the population under study. For instance, if you're considering asking long-term care residents to wear a watch-type device so you can collect timely health data from them, you should consider the suitability of the device for this population. Residents in long-term care facilities are mostly older and frail. Dermatological diagnoses are extremely frequent. Many suffer from extremely dry skin and bruising. So you have to consider where wearing a medical device contribute further to their skin deterioration. Has the device been tested in this population? Will the device slip off and become lost? And then what will you do if you're a researcher? Many personal items are lost in long-term care homes. The best advice is to speak with experts such as nurses who work in long-term care homes, and they can be very beneficial in advising you. Or other experts, nurses, could be physicians. Was the device, what's another ethical issue? Was the device approved for use or research purposes in Canada? I mentioned this point previously. Ensure the device or software is licensed in Canada, or ensure that an authorization the authorization letter from Health Canada is obtained. Another ethical issue involves the use of a control group. If the device is already known to be effective, then the use of a control group may be unethical because we know it works already. Is the experimental procedure well explained to participants? And this is a biggie. Medical devices can appear to be complex to the average layperson. Some device studies are considered high risk. Researchers have a responsibility to simplify complex information so that the information conveyed is easy to understand. I've known of some researchers who use pictorials or videos, and they can be helpful. If you decide to use pictorials or videos, these are to be uploaded in the REB sub-study application form for the REB's review. If a medical device software is employed, what privacy protections have been considered? You have to consider that REBs and institutions consider that privacy protections are a very big concern. A data management plan should accompany all study applications to the REB, but it's especially important for this type of study, and I refer you to the Portage application. Other issues involve conflict of interest, commercial or financial interest, and were they disclosed? How are you going to manage them? Many researchers have established partnerships with industry or have created their own companies, which creates conflict of interest, and they have to be managed. These interests have to be managed. A device inventor should not be a principal investigator, and a major shareholder in a company that developed the device should never have a role in patient data collection or analysis. Next, please. In the final part of this presentation, I'm going to speak about patient-reported outcomes research. I was made aware that several of you are conducting this type of research. The FDA defined patient-reported outcome research as any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation of the patient's response by a clinician or anyone else. The type of information collected from research participants for patient-reported outcome research can be wide-ranging. Reports from patients include signs, observable manifestations of a condition, sensations, most commonly classified as symptoms that may be attributable to disease and treatment, behaviors and abilities commonly classified as functional status, general perceptions of feelings of well-being, general health, satisfaction with treatment, reports of adverse events, adherence to treatment, and participation in social or community events and health-related quality of life. And I've put those several concepts in bold for a reason. Behaviors, feeling of well-being, treatment satisfaction, and elements related to quality of life. This type of data collection indicates that psychosocial research is a common form of patient-reported outcome research. So psychosocial research can engender psychological risks of harm. My focus will be on REB requirements regarding these risks and strategies to mitigate them. Many people, if you in the medical sciences, I have found sometimes do not consider psychological risks. So questions contained in surveys or questionnaires or interviews have the potential to present a threat to participants' psychological well-being. The nature of the questions asked may give rise to negative emotions such as anxiety and distress, among others. The perspective of the participant should be foremost when evaluating the potential for psychological risk of harm. Some research populations evidently may be at higher risk for psychological harm than others. I take the example of a participant who has undergone an invasive procedure and is not recovering well and lives alone without family or friends upon which they can rely. When this participant receives a questionnaire that includes questions about the nature of their social support and quality of life, these questions have the potential to generate feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Asking participants who are refractory to treatment and have exhausted all their treatment options questions about whether and to what degree they may be depressed can raise participants' awareness about how depressed they really are and possibly magnify pre-existing symptoms of depression. Participants may be placed at psychological risk by participating in this type of research. Next, please. The potential for psychological risk can be present in quantitative research, in questionnaires and surveys, and in qualitative studies or mixed methods research, in questionnaires containing open-ended questions, in interviews and focus groups. Next, please. A researcher must ensure that mitigation strategies to deal with potential risks of harm are in place. These mitigation strategies are set in place proportionally according to the degree of participants' potential discomfort and emotions. If a participant experiences mild discomfort during a study, they're to be reminded that they may refuse any question and still remain in the study or take a break. If a participant experiences a mild level of distress, they're to be reminded they may refuse to answer any question and still remain in the study or take a break, depending on the judgment of the research team member. On the level of the participant's distress, the participant may be asked if they wish to withdraw from the study. If a participant experiences a moderate level of emotional distress, depending on the research team member's judgment, if necessary, the team member may suggest to the participant that they be accompanied or referred to an appropriate resource with the participant's permission. If a participant experiences a higher extreme level or emotional distress, such as suicide ideation or threatens self-harm or harm to others, the possibility of seeking out emergency services is presented to the participant. The participant should be accompanied by the research team member throughout this process. Our health institution has established procedures for dealing with high or extreme emotional distress for professionals to follow. Next, please. Sorry. Could I see the next slide, please? Yeah. So what are some examples of the studies that may provoke different degrees of psychological harm? An anonymous online survey distributed to asking participants about their quality of life after a minor surgical procedure. It may be considered a study with low risk of psychological harm. However, for some participants, this survey may raise negative emotions because they've already experienced depressive symptoms due to perhaps a post-operative complication or a lack of social support. In this case, when there's no contact with the participant, a list of resources should appear at the end of the survey. That could include, for example, contact information for professional services. When there's a moderate or high risk of psychological harm, examples of studies that may contain foreseeable risks for moderate or high degree of negative emotions or distress could include a study involving invasive heart procedure in patients with advanced heart disease and prolonged psychological testing. Prolonged psychological testing may be physically and mentally exhausting and cause a participant to dwell on current health conditions, giving rise to negative thinking. We've seen studies submitted to the REB where researchers have asked participants who were in very poor health to complete between 8 and 12 self-report questionnaires at one time. The REB did grant approval for, the REB did not grant ethics approval for the completion of so many questionnaires. Study procedures that could provoke high degrees of negative emotions or distress could also include asking participants to discuss their post-recovery experiences after invasive surgical procedures following severe physical and psychological trauma caused by a bad automobile accident. Just reflecting or recounting their lived experience has the potential to re-traumatize participants. I provide an actual example where researchers designed a study to evaluate a patient support program for patients who had advanced disease and were refractory to treatment. I'm not going to name the program nor the disease for reasons of confidentiality. The study procedures included a self-report validated depression score questionnaire to be completed electronically to measure the severity of the participant's depression. Remember, the purpose of the study was to study the patient support program and not to study depression. Researchers anticipated that some of their participants may be severely depressed due to their deteriorating health condition and expected at least some participants would obtain a high depression score when completing the questionnaire. Much to the researchers' credit, they developed a mitigation strategy to deal with participants who reported a high depression score. The researchers would be alerted electronically when they noted participants received a high depression score. Note they used the REDCap application. In turn, researchers would alert the participants' designated treating clinicians about this high score. These treating clinicians would then follow up with these participants. Importantly, participants had been informed about this medication strategy before giving their informed consent, and this information was included in their consent form. When the likelihood for potential risks of psychological harm is present, the REB expects that a strategy for minimizing the risk of harm according to the severity of that potential harm be included in the protocol. Mitigation strategies to reduce harm may differ according not only to the risk of harm, but the population involved, the data collection methods used. For instance, in a study exploring the experiences of older populations, risk mitigation strategies should include resources that are suited to the specific needs of an older population. Next, please. At our institution, we have created a guidance document for developing a protocol for the mitigation of psychological risks incurred during the conduct of a research study. And this is found as well on the Nagano platform in the documentation section. The guidance document carefully outlines a range of safeguards put into place according to the level of discomfort and negative emotions that participants may experience, whether they be mild, moderate, or severe. Depending on the study, these study procedures may contain more than one mitigation strategy according to the potential for various levels of distress. When several mitigation strategies for distress are envisioned, they can be included in a separate document entitled Distress Protocol. The need for a distress protocol depends on the complexity, the level, and the potential risk of harm. REBs evaluate not only the mitigation strategies researchers have put in place, but also evaluate that research team members who interact with study participants are properly qualified to recognize and deal with the negative emotions that have the potential to create psychological harm. Next, please. Finally, other ethical issues are associated with patient-reported outcomes research. For example, you have to ensure inclusivity, diversity, and equity when recruiting. Studies should reflect a diversity of perspectives. For instance, in many studies, the perspective of certain cultural groups or older people are left out. The study should be designed in a way that it is sensitive to perspectives of racial and cultural communities. For example, if conducting research on Indigenous communities, researchers should create relationships with the communities they wish to study, as I've mentioned before, and obtain their input. When conducting studies with cultural communities or patients with specific diseases, include patients as partners or collaborators in the research. It's advisable and can be very helpful to the researcher. For example, the contribution of patients' experiential knowledge can be very helpful for research such as involving learning health systems that integrate research with practice. So that comes to the end. Next, please. I don't think I have any more slides. Yeah, so I leave you now with time for questions.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation again. There are some questions in the chat if you can access.
Yes, I'm going to chat. Okay. I'm not able to, I'm sorry, but I'm not able to get, I saw, oh, here, okay, it came up. Does the chair assign the specialist? No, the chair, the REB, the chair, the REB, well, how can I explain this? The institution takes the responsibility for recruiting and vetting a specialist. This specialist has to be approved by the REB. And once the specialist approved from the REB, then the board of directors of the institution, there's a procedure in place where the board of directors approves the nomination of the specialist as a non-voting member of the REB. I hope that answered your question. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Is the feasibility review the longest process? Okay, that's a big question. That depends on your study. Are you using a lot of hospital resources? Do you need pharmacy? Do you need nursing? Are you sharing data outside the institution? Do you need a data sharing agreement? Then it all depends on how your study is designed. For instance, I was talking about Loi 25. So if you do, I think it's part of the same question. What do you mean without participants' consent? So if you're conducting health records research, let's say I want to study the health records of people from January 2010 to present day. So clearly it would be too hard for you to obtain consent, even if you were doing a study involving, I don't know, a surgery or some specific, or you're looking at, blood samples or whatever it is you're doing. Sometimes it's too difficult or too cumbersome or impossible even to obtain everybody's consent to look at health data. So that's what I mean by without participants' consent, but there are special conditions upon which you need to follow. So to go back to feasibility review. So you're doing this type of study. So you don't need pharmacy, you don't need anybody, you're just going through health records. But health records involves medical records. And what I said before, Loi 25, now have this new process that the government imposed. So you have to go through this EFVP committee. And so we're asking you to fill in this form. So the process is that even though the REB may have approved your study, There are other processes, like this committee has to approve that you can conduct the research. They feel that the privacy and confidentialities have been properly addressed, because you're accessing health records, and the government wants to make sure that the processes are in place to make sure that this is the data being extracted and used is being done properly. I hope I answered your question. Feel free.
Yes, Linda, thank you. Thank you for.
Okay. Next question. Do you have data protection expert who can advise issues related to data privacy and security? That's a good question. The person who, it's Dr. Mawali. That would be Dr. Mawali. The Lady Davis has an IT department, and they have specialists that are there to help you.
Okay.
So they're usually the best bet for researchers when they're designing their studies.
So, but on the committee, do you normally have such a person, or just sometimes when you need one?
Normally everybody should know a lot about this, should know about this. I mean, we have people who know about data privacy issues. Where it gets, again, there's no clear delineation, because data protection confidentiality is a responsibility shared with the institution, the REB, and the researcher.
Okay.
So but the REB does look, yes, it does look at privacy issues. And
Okay.
if there's a section missing in your protocol, you haven't addressed them. And as I mentioned, we're more and more requiring researchers to submit a data management plan, and it's already required for people conducting health records research without the consent of participants, because we don't have participants' consent, so the privacy issues become especially important.
Okay, thank you.
What would the REB policy and advice regarding accidentally identified situations, leukopenia, low white blood cells, while assessing blood for another thing like hemoglobin? So we're referring here to incidental findings. So if you find something that there's expected, I have another presentation on this. There's some that are expected, you expect them to occur, so you should plan ahead and you put it in your protocol. I might expect some participants to have leukopenia, so because of the nature of my study. So how am I going to do it? In other cases, when it's unexpected, you should contact the researcher, the participant. You should have a plan in place that if something happens, how will you deal with an incidental finding? And especially if you're a physician, that puts you particularly in a conflicted position, because you have a duty to help this participant. And especially if it's unethical to tell somebody that that they have a condition, that you can treat a condition and you don't tell them they have it. The other aspect of this is when it involves genetic research. So usually when it involves genetics or genome, usually you consider this ahead of time. And you may ask the participant, and that's often in the consent form, do you want to receive the results? Because it may not only have implications for them, it may have implications for other members of the family, and they themselves may want or may not want to receive the results if you find something. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, this is one of the questions in McGill IRB. Before I read it, I just want to make the distinction, and I want everybody to understand there's a distinction between a university IRB and a CIUSSS, a health institution that falls under the health network governed by the Quebec government, by the Ministry of Health. They're two separate things. You cannot recruit participants from a university by obtaining our IRB, McGill IRB approval. You cannot recruit participants at our institution. that's not, you can't access our data, you can't access our patients, you have to go through our institution. So I sometimes you researchers don't know that. So I wanted to mention that. So asking McGill REB, new human protocol application. Please explain any reasonable and foreseeable disclosure requirements. Yes, disclosure to third parties such as government agencies or departments, community partners in research, personnel from an agency, monitors research, CROs, research sponsor, the REB or regulatory agencies, as well as the requirements some journals have for open access to research data and the need to disclose to participants how this may impact data confidentiality. These are all important. In our consent form, we have clauses that are already in our consent form template that says your study may be monitored by the REB. So the confidentiality is limited, because if we get a complaint or something happens, or the study sponsor has the right to go in and examine the data and examine all the records. So the participant is told. So that's what is meant by disclosure to third parties. You may get a grant from CIHR. Health Canada may come to audit. FRSQ, the FRQ may come, those that give government grants, they may come and audit. So you have to advise the participant that these agencies may review. I can pull up the exact, if we have time, I can pull up the exact statement that says, you know, these parties can have access to your data. So they're aware.
So as long as we're explaining that, in our consent form, like we have clauses advising the participant of X, Y, and Z, like that's all we need to say to answer this question. Just like advise them that we have the proper clauses all accounted for in the ICF.
Well, that's part of your question. Yeah. So that part of it is like advising them that other people can look at their data. The second part of this is the requirement some journals have to open access to research data. So that would be another, you need to disclose that. So the participant is informed and decides, you know, do I want somebody looking at my data, even though I'm participating in this clinical trial, or my data is going to be posted? You know, they have to be informed that this is what's going to be happening with their data. So more and more we have open access to research data. I mean, if there are no identifiers, you know, participants may be less reticent, and that's the kind of information you write in the consent form, and so on. You've submitted to the McGill IRB? Or
I'm working on an application to the McGill REB for an addition of a private clinic as a satellite site for an already ongoing trial where we have MUHC REB approval, but because the MUHC REB does not can't cover REB reviews for external sites. I was advised to request a separate REB review from McGill for this additional site, and just to upload all the approval documents from the MUHC REB. I hope that, like, I was advised that this is okay to do, and
no, that's a very good point that you brought up, and I'm glad you brought it up, because understand that you have to understand that we give permission, and it also involves insurance, that we're insured for our patients in our hospitals and under all those institutions under our umbrella of the CIUSSS. But we do not have, the REB does not have insurance for studies going on the outside. So we can't, and we don't have jurisdiction. So we can't give you approval for private clinics or community groups. Some do it, but I think you've been well advised for the way you've explained it. So.
Well, thanks for your answer. You definitely clarified this question. That's part of the application. I was just concerned on like how to answer it, but just to make sure I understand everything, you're saying that as long, like, to answer this question, we basically just have to explain that all of the clauses have been included in the ICF and just acknowledge like each of these.
You have to create a clause. I don't know if the McGill IRB has a, check your, I'm pretty sure the McGill IRB, McGill REB consent form has that information. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so you should just have to do a copy and paste to put it in.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you very much.
I have another question here. Sorry for so many words. Can you clarify how we should be answering that question? Especially
that was me.
You, sorry, Cassandra.
Yeah, it's just because there was a lot of words. I had just copy pasted the question from the application. So that was just me asking you to clarify it, but you've already answered it. Thank you very much.
I'm very familiar with those words, so it's okay. Okay, if you are doing a prospective cohort study, which gathers data from another ongoing randomized control trial, do you need to submit the prospective study cohort to the RBS? So if any study that you're doing, you're using, if I understand well, Ronnie, you're using data, you've got an ongoing trial, you've collected data from that trial, and now you're considering doing a new study, or are you considering an amendment?
It's more an amendment, but this study is going to be more specific in what we're got, like what data we're capturing from the, it's more just for the blood analysis.
Without reading your protocol, I would suspect you only need an amendment. So you have your study. We thought we were going to do it this way. Now we're going to do it another way. What's the justification for the amendment that should be included in the protocol? And you have to change what's in your consent form as well.
So if the amendment was if the amendment was done in the randomized control trial and it's been accepted, then there is no problem with the prospective cohort study, right?
I don't know what you mean by prospective cohort study.
So we're basically like studying as we're going of what's going on in the randomized control trial. It's by two different PIs, that's why.
It's hard for me to answer that because why do you have two different PIs?
It's not for me. So I'm working with like my study that's capturing data from another one. I think this is more of a question to ask in like one-to-one. It's maybe more complex.
Yeah, it's more complex, and you can write to us, you can write to me or whoever, and we'll try and answer it. Because also without understanding what was first approved and then not understanding what you actually want to change, it's difficult. Because the issues that we would consider is are there two groups? Is the aim the same? All those considerations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just out of curiosity, did you find this helpful?
Me, yes.
Yeah, or anybody else?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the refresher.
Sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much. I wasn't aware of the healer case. We took it for granted, just buying cells from Fisher and things like that, the healer cells, and using them over the years. I was aware of the tribe, the Havasupai tribe, something like that, who they took the blood from the tribe. It was supposed to be used for
yes.
that. Yes. And then they were using it for other things.
There was even more than that. The Hasupi tribe, if I remember correctly, they used this data, and then at the time, I think this happened in the 1990s, there were people, they presented the results at a conference, and there was a person from the Hasupi tribe present at the conference. And there they learned, among other things, I don't remember all the specific details, but there was a high incidence of schizophrenia in the population.
Right.
So what that did is discriminated. So then the people coming away from this conference had this impression that, and they realized that there was the Hasupi tribe couldn't control the information, so that everybody, the researchers and even the general public, because I think it was reported in the media, considered that this community was labeled because it had a high incidence of schizophrenia.
Right.
And that was ethically unacceptable and terrible. So that this is why you have to consider the individual and the community when you conduct research. So I don't know if I was getting to what you wanted, Dr. Mawali.
Yeah, I understood. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you once again, Dr. Furlini, for that wonderful. So I think there is another hand up.
Sorry, while I have you here, I do have one more question, if you don't mind.
Oh, no.
Regarding the informed consent forms, you were mentioning that how the templates of whether it's the like MUHC, REB, or the CIUSSS, REB templates, like that they have the clauses included, and you said that the McGill IRB has a separate template with their own clauses. If I'm adding an additional site, but this this new site is going to be the REB approval will be done by the McGill IRB. Does that mean that I would have to create a new informed consent form, but under the template of the McGill IRB?
Generally, yeah. Okay. Every institution has theirs. Okay. And if you're part of the Quebec Healthcare Network, you can do it two ways, because we have a thing called multi-center mechanism. So if, say, you were doing the research at the MUHC and at our site, then you just submit one REB application. You wouldn't have as much work to do, but you could either create two local consent forms or do one, like for instance, you put both logos. And the other thing that has to be included is, I don't know if I go back to that, I don't know if they put it in, but generally you have like in our institutions, you have to say if you have a complaint or you have a problem, you have to contact the ombudsman. I don't know who, so I don't know who you'd put in that situation. You'd have to ask McGill.
Yeah, it's a very specific scenario where patients are like recruited from like the MUHC, but because they perform because they're low risk surgeries and because the wait list is so big, this private clinic has allowed them to rent their space like a couple times a week and do the surgeries there. So they're patients from the MUHC, but the surgeries are being performed at this clinic. So it's a little complicated, but I might have to ask someone else then.
I think I would contact the McGill IRB. That's another, if I leave you with something, when you're not sure, contact your IRB or your REB. They will give you, because everything is specific. I can conduct a study at another CIUSSS and they'll have other requirements. So it's best to speak to you. And they're usually we're pretty good. We like giving advice, especially when we get thoughtful researchers who think about those things before they submit.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you very much, Dr. Furlini, and thank you everyone for coming to attending the meeting. Please enjoy the very mild winter we're having. So
thank you, Dr. Mawali.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.